Hi, my name's Si Horton and I'm an application engineer for our 3D Doc team here at FARO UK. Following on from previous tutorials where I've guided you through the process of bringing scan data onto survey control, what I'd like to demonstrate here is how to change the transformation of your scans across a single cluster or several clusters to a known datum point. Here we have a simple project in scene 5.4.10. I'm going to work through 3 examples. The first 2 examples will be starting from scratch before we even attempt to do a registration. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to work with a top view and a cloud-to-cloud registration, although the same principles apply if we were doing a target-based registration. If we first look at the transformation of one of the scans, you can see here that the Z value on this particular scan is 38.8691. This Z value relates to the height of the physical scanner. So if we're trying to set a datum point on a surface, on a floor, on a nail, on a target, we first need to calculate the height of that scanner above that particular datum point. To do this, if I go to the planar view and look at the data first, what you'll see are scans that I've used before when I brought this data in and registered it onto survey control. The data once again is courtesy of Bury Associates in Worcester. So what I'm going to assume is that I've got a particular datum point or a nail on the floor. So I'm going to mark that point in the planar view and I'm going to call it datum. Once I've got that point set, I need to then look at the difference in height between that datum point and the scanner. So if I mark a polygon area around the datum point, then right click and view that in 3D, I can see my datum point on the screen, and as I rotate and zoom out, I should start to see the head of the scanner. If you don't see the head of the scanner, then if you go to your visibility settings either on the toolbar or by right clicking on the screen and going to visibility settings, in the extras tab you have scan positions where you can turn the scan positions on or turn the scan positions off. Then, because we have 2 objects, i.e. the scanner head and the datum point, we then use the measure between objects tool to measure between that datum point and the scanner head. And that tells me that the height of the scanner above that datum point on the floor is 1.7111 millimeters. Depending on where you want to set your datum point, you need to add that value to your known or your required datum point. So for instance, if I wanted my datum on the floor to be set at 0, I would set my height of Z transformation to be 1.7111 millimeters. Or if I wanted my datum point to be 100, it'd be 101.7111. We finished with that now. So if I close that down, I'm going to delete that measurement. And then I'm going to go into the transformation of this particular scan. Go into the properties, go to transformation, and I'm going to change that transformation to be 1.7111 millimeters, and then click OK. So now I know that the floor, in theory, is set to 0. Now this is much easier to do at the beginning before you even start doing your registrations. If you have to do it retrospectively, then it takes a little bit longer, but I'll demonstrate that very shortly. So now I've got my datum set. The key thing I need to do is mark that scan as my reference scan, because if it's marked as my reference scan, when I then do a registration, every other scan as it's being registered will relate back to that reference scan. For instance, if I now look at this particular scan and look at the transformation, I can see that the transformation is 40.87487. So we'll close that down, we'll get rid of that selection box on the screen, close that window down, and as always, before doing any registration in FARO Scene, always make sure to unload all your scans. Scene doesn't need the scans to be loaded. If the scans are loaded, they're sat in the RAM of the machine, and it could potentially make your registration process a lot slower than it needs to be. So all I'm going to do is go in and do a top view registration and let the system do its thing. So now my top view is finished, what I'm going to do is go in and do a cloud to cloud. Now a little tip, rather than having to go right click, operations, registration, place scans, what you can do, if you're going to do a different registration method, you can merely right click on the scan manager and do update scans, and then change your method up here to be cloud to cloud. If I'd done a drastic change to the transformation in one of the scans, when you use the update, it doesn't necessarily rerun the registration or pull a scan into that location. So I always prefer to do the registration from scratch. But using this method, it just saves you a few extra clicks or a few more path lengths in order to get to the same dialog box a lot quicker. So now I'm going to choose Cloud to Cloud and click OK. My Cloud to Cloud is now finished, so I'm going to close that. And the first check I'm going to do before I go any further is to check the transformation of that last scan again. First, we'll check the scan that we first changed to make sure that the height in Z is 1.7111 millimeters still. Then, if I check this one and go to the transformation, we'll see that that height is slightly higher because there must be a slope in the data or a change in level in the data between scan 200 and scan 210. Next, we'll do a visual check in correspondence view. So I'll right click on my scan folder, go to correspondence. So the system tells me, based on my machine and the scans I've got, it could load 107 million points. But for the purposes of this, we only need 1 million points loaded. My first visual check would be to make sure that the scans that have been done follow a pattern similar to those that you've done on site. i.e. if scan number 210 was down here somewhere, you know there's something wrong with the registration. But as you can see, the scans move sequentially based on their order in a sensible pattern. The next visual check I would do will be to zoom in and to look at the overlap density between the scans to make sure the vertical surfaces are aligned. Another little tip here, if you turn on clear view mode, it makes it a lot easier to see those vertical surfaces during the alignment. And the last visual check I would do is to change to examine mode and start to see that everything aligns. And I'm looking at elevations to make sure all the windows are aligned. So as we can see there, the registration is pretty decent with regards to the location of each individual scan. You may remember that I loaded this particular correspondence view with 1 million points. Another little tip, if you're trying to decimate the data or export the data from scene, rather than apply subsampling on export, if you've loaded a limited number of scans into the correspondence view, then what you can do is export the scan points directly from the correspondence view. If I exported now as an E57 file, that E57 file would only export 1 million scan points because that's all I've got loaded and visible on the screen. For instance, if I wanted 5 million, when I loaded the correspondence view, I'd load 5 million, then export, and I'd only have 5 million points. So it's a nice, quick and easy way to get limited data out of scene by exporting it from the correspondence view, where you can control the number of points visible on the screen. So that's the first way of changing the transformation on the system before you even get anywhere near the registration. Choose your scan with your known datum point, check the height of the scanner, set the transformation Z of that one scan, set it as a reference scan, and then proceed with your registration. Next, we're going to look at doing the same thing but across two clusters. All I've done now is split the scans into two clusters, and this time I'm going to choose this particular scan with the datum point in. So same thing applies. We'll go to our planar view, we'll pick our point on the floor, which we'll do down here, call it datum, put a window area around that datum, look at that datum in the 3D view, rotate that around, zoom out so we can see the scanner head, measure between the two objects. That gives us a height of 2.0116, so we can close that down and close that down. We go into this scan and we go to properties and transformation, and we change the height of this scan. This time we're going to do 102.0016. So we're setting our datum at 100 meters. Click OK. We're going to mark that particular scan as our reference scan, and this time we're going to mark this cluster as our reference cluster. So any other cluster is going to look back at the reference cluster first and then look for the reference scan, and it's going to modify the transformations of the other clusters and the other scans within those clusters back to this reference cluster and this reference scan. Again, as I mentioned before we do any registration, I unload all my scans and I'll follow exactly the same procedure. I'm going to first do a top view to do a rough position, and then I'll do a cloud to cloud. That's now complete. So first thing I will do is check the transformation on one of the other scans in that same cluster, and you can see that the transformation has changed relative to our reference scan. Also, what I'm going to do is have a quick look at the correspondence view, and whilst we can see that I haven't got round to registering the front cluster yet, if I were to rotate this round at the side, you'll see that the transformation is wildly different between the two clusters. So the next process I need to go through is to register the front cluster, then register the master cluster up here to bring both of these clusters together based on this reference scan and this reference cluster. That registration is now all complete, so as always I've taken care to lock my scan managers as I go to make sure once I'm happy with the registration in each cluster, I know the data isn't going to move as long as the scan manager is locked. So again, before we go any further, I'll go in and look at the correspondence view and do my visual checks. So first off, look in plan, flip to clear view mode, look at the overlap, change to examine mode, set the center of rotation and look at the horizontal. Last thing, go into one of the scans in the other cluster and look at the properties and the transformation. So now I can see there that the height of the scanner is 101.5671 and the floor will be relative to that below. So that's now looking at how we change the transformation of a series of scans across multiple clusters before we even go in to starting the registration. Next we're going to look at changing a project that has already been registered across multiple clusters and how we change that transformation. On this particular project, we've worked on the project, we've worked through all the clusters, and we've got all our registrations set to where we want them to be. But now we've realised that we want to change the transformation of the entire project ready for export. This is where it becomes a little bit more long-winded. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing as before. This time I'm going to pick a completely different scan, go to the planar view, look at that planar view, find a point on the floor, mark that with a point, call it datum, click OK, place a selection window around that area, and then view that in 3D, set my centre of rotation, zoom out till I find the scanner head, use the measure object tool, measure between the two. This time we've got 1.8274. Close that view down. I don't need that measurement anymore, so I'm just going to delete it. Then we're going to go into that scan, change the transformation. This time we're going to change it so we want datum on the floor to be 0. So we set the point here to be 1.8274. Click OK. Right click on the scan, go to Operations Registration Reference Scan. This time it will warn us that we already have a reference scan in this particular cluster, and do we want to set a new reference scan? So we click yes, we set the reference cluster, so again Operations Registration Reference Cluster, similar message, do we want to set a new reference object? So I'll click yes. Now if I unload those scans and then I look at that particular correspondence view for that one cluster, just loading 1 million points, you'll see that if I change to examine mode, the height of that one scan has changed. Now here, if I unload them, you don't actually need to load the scans to see where your labels are and that you've changed your registration in the correspondence view. You can just use the labels and see it visually. So this time, I'd have to go through, unlock. Now if I just did a cloud-to-cloud registration on these, the cloud-to-cloud registration will fail. But to prove that principle, let's go in and go to Operations, Registration and Place Scans, and we're just going to do a cloud-to-cloud registration. If I choose Update, it's not necessarily going to update the registration because the transformation of the 3 scans is now so wildly different. So all I do is run the registration again. So here you can see, as predicted, the registration has failed. So I click OK and click OK. The reason for that is that cloud-to-cloud is looking for common constellations or patterning or overlay between scan points. Because the transformation is so wildly different between the positions of those 3 scans, cloud-to-cloud physically won't work. Now, I could either move the 2 scans 0, 9 and 0, 8 down in the correspondence view so they overlap with scan number 10, or I can simply run a top view and then a cloud-to-cloud again, because top view is looking at common vertical surfaces. So it's going to use that to do the rough alignment, and then cloud-to-cloud will work. So all I do is go through that exact same process, Operations, Registration, Place Scans. We'll do a top view first, and then I'll do a cloud-to-cloud. This time then, I'm going to go to my master cluster, and I'm going to view all the scans in a correspondence view, where I'll load 1 million points. It asks me and tells me that some of the clusters aren't located in the center of their scans, so we're just going to move that cluster location so they are in the center of the scans, as it's not going to affect any of the transformations. So click yes. Those are now loaded. So if I look at this from the side, you can see that the transformation of the back cluster is wildly different to the front two. So now we have a choice. Depending on how many clusters you have, if we want to move these 2 clusters to relate to our reference scan and our reference cluster, we would have to work through and run the registrations of each individual cluster again, because the transformation is so wildly different. The only way to update it is to run them again. Or what we can do is, using the correspondence view, if we look at the view from the side and then we take the middle cluster, if for instance your zoom value is out of view and you can't see the handles for your clusters, on your numerical keypad on your laptop or your full-size keyboard you have the plus and minus symbol. If you use that plus and minus symbol, you can change the size of the object handles for the correspondence view. This also works for clipping boxes as well. And all I'm going to do is drag this one down and locate it roughly in its position, which is about there, lining up the overlap on this area here. And then I'll pick this cluster and I'll drag that down as well and position it roughly by waiting for the refresh so I can see that lines roughly overlap. This is quite a good procedure if you're doing cloud-to-cloud registration as well. If your scans aren't quite registering, you can manually place them in the correspondence view, and then in effect you put the constellations over the top of one another manually. Think of it as a quick way of not doing a top view registration, and then when you run the registration it will then update everything to suit. So now all I'm going to do is firstly unload all my scans, unlock my master cluster, and just to make sure, rather than doing any updates, I'm actually going to run a cloud-to-cloud registration again, just to make sure I get it right first time. That registration is now complete. First thing I do, lock my scan manager. Next thing I do is check in plan, either by looking in a normal view or flip into a clear view and looking at the overlap between my clusters, which looks relatively good. Then I go to examine mode, set my center of rotation and look to make sure I've got all my heights the same. Then I'll go to one of the scans, firstly via the reference scan, look at the transformation as a reminder, and now every other scan should be similar to that based on the height of the scanner in that location. So there you have it. That's how to change the transformation of your scans and your clusters based on a reference scan which lives in a reference cluster. Hopefully I've highlighted that making that decision at the beginning of the project before you even start registration will save you quite a lot of time than having to come back to it at the end and do any updates. Thank you for watching. I hope it's been of use, and please feel free to look out for forthcoming movies.